What happens when a country pushes out the people who know how to keep the lights on? And what if the blackout that follows is not caused by one bad night, but by years of pride, politics, bad deals, and a dangerous loss of skill? Before we go deeper, hit like, subscribe, and share this with one friend who loves stories where one decision changes the fate of a whole nation. Because this one starts with electricity and ends with a warning. Picture Johannesburg at rush hour. Cars stack up dead traffic lights. Shops go dim. Elevators stop between floors. Hospital workers glance at backup systems and pray the fuel will last. At home, fridges begin to warm. Freezers begin to drip. Students lean over school books by candlelight. Small stores close early. Machines on factory floors freeze in place. Then the city gets quiet in the strangest way. Not peaceful quiet, nervous quiet. The kind of quiet that tells you something bigger is going wrong. For millions of South Africans, that was not one terrible evening. It became normal life. The country called it load shedding, planned blackouts, rotating cuts, a polite phrase for a brutal reality. In 2023, South Africa lost almost 25,000 gigawatt hours of electricity through load shedding. The economic pain was massive. Businesses lost output, families lost food, clinics lost reliable power, people lost trust. And when trust goes dark, the damage reaches far beyond the grid. That is why this story matters. On the surface, it sounds simple. South Africa pushed out white engineers, the grid collapsed, then the country wanted them back. That is the version that travels fast online. It is sharp. It is emotional. It gives you villains, victims, and a clean ending. But the real story is more serious than a slogan, because South Africa's power crisis was not built by one policy, one group, or one year. It was built by a collision: skills loss, political pressure, weak maintenance, state capture, corruption, bad coal, broken training, delayed repairs, fear inside the system. And yes, race politics was part of that storm too. If we flatten the story, we miss the lesson. And the lesson is the whole point. To understand the collapse, we have to go back to when Eskom was not a joke. It was not a warning sign, not a symbol of national frustration. It was one of the pride points of the country. In the late 1990s, Eskom was widely seen as one of the strongest utilities in the world. Its power stations were respected. Its engineers were respected. Its system had enough strength that South Africa could even support neighbors with electricity exports. Cheap, stable electricity helped mines run, factories expand, and cities grow. For an industrial economy, reliable power is not just a service, it is oxygen. And behind that power sat a deep bench of technical people: plant operators, artisans, boiler specialists, electrical engineers, mechanical engineers, maintenance planners, grid experts. People who knew what a healthy machine sounded like and what a dangerous vibration meant before a sensor even screamed. Some had degrees, some had trade training, some had decades in the same plants. They knew the system by memory, by habit, by smell, by sound. That kind of knowledge is hard to measure. It lives in the hands and the nerves. It moves from one generation to the next through mentorship, repetition, and time. Then South Africa entered a new era. Apartheid had ended. The country was trying to rebuild itself morally, politically, and economically. That change was necessary. No honest person can tell the story of modern South Africa without saying that the old system was cruel, unjust, and built on exclusion. The new government had a real challenge in front of it. It had to open doors that had been locked for too long. It had to create a state that looked more like the people it served. It had to transform workplaces that had long shut out the black majority. That goal was real. The problem was not the goal. The problem was what happens when transformation inside a complex technical system moves too fast. It moved faster than the system's ability to train, mentor, and transfer critical knowledge. At Eskom, many of the older and more experienced engineers and artisans were white. That was not because white people were naturally better at engineering. It was because apartheid had given white South Africans more access to technical education and career ladders for decades. So when the post-apartheid state began changing Eskom's workforce, the practical result was that many experienced people left. Most of those leaving were white men. Some were pushed by political pressure. Some took voluntary severance packages. Some saw no future for themselves. Some were tired of conflict. Some were angry. Some were hired overseas. Some simply walked away. And here's the part that matters. They did not leave one by one across a calm and stable pipeline of replacement. Too often, they left faster than their knowledge could be passed on. That is a deadly problem inside a power utility. Because a grid is not a social media company. You cannot just swap people and tell the system to adjust. A power station is a living machine made of heat, pressure, timing, chemistry, vibration, and maintenance discipline. It relies on thousands of small judgments. A bad weld done today can become a trip next month. A dirty conveyor can become a breakdown in 3 weeks. A weak inspection culture can sit hidden for years, then explode into public disaster in one awful winter. Some new recruits at Eskom were bright and qualified, Many had strong formal education. But formal education and lived plant experience are not the same thing. You can know the theory of a boiler and still fail in front of a real unit that has been stressed and misfired. These units were kept alive by veterans who learned its moods over 20 years. You can pass an exam and still miss the early sign of failure that an older artisan would catch by ear. That would have been survivable if Eskom had protected mentorship. If it had slowed the exits, if it had paired young engineers with old hands for years, if performance discipline had stayed ruthless, if politics had stopped at the gate of the turbine hall. But that is not what happened. Over time, the pipeline of learning weakened. Mentorship faded, internal confidence thinned out, succession planning slipped, some promotions moved faster than experience should have allowed. People were placed in seats before they were fully ready, not because they were stupid, not because they did not care, but because the system was under pressure to change faster than capacity could be rebuilt. And just when that would have required strong leadership, something worse arrived: corruption. This is the piece many people miss when they tell this story as pure race politics. South Africa's grid did not collapse only because experienced engineers left. It also collapsed because the institution itself was hollowed out. State capture poisoned Eskom. Procurement networks bled it. Politically connected deals pushed money toward the wrong places. Maintenance was delayed. Bad coal entered the system. Costs climbed. Debt piled up. Skilled people inside the utility were sidelined or exhausted. Some of the people left in decision-making roles were not there because they were the best. They were there because the institution had become easier to manipulate. And once that happens, a utility starts to rot. Imagine trying to run old coal plants on poor coal. Imagine delaying maintenance because outages are politically painful, then suffering even worse outages later because you delayed too long. Imagine trying to rebuild a damaged unit without the best internal skills because the people who knew the equipment already left. Imagine calling in outside contractors for work your own teams once handled with pride. Imagine trying to tell the truth upward in a political culture that does not reward bad news. That is how a crisis grows, quietly first, then all at once. By the 2010s, Eskom's energy availability kept dropping. Breakdowns were rising. Unplanned outages became common. Load shedding became a national word. First, it felt temporary. Then, it felt familiar. Then, it felt permanent. South Africans planned their lives around blackout schedules. Restaurants changed hours. Families bought candles in bulk. Businesses added generators if they could afford them. The rich went solar. The poor sat in the dark longer. And that is one of the cruelest parts of infrastructure failure. It punishes everybody, but not equally. If you have money, a broken grid is a headache. You buy batteries, diesel, inverters, security backups. If you do not have money, a broken grid can ruin your food, your medicine, and your safety. A blackout is not just the absence of light. It is the loss of rhythm, the loss of control. It is the loss of dignity in ordinary life. If you care about stories that explain the hidden systems behind everyday life, subscribe now, tap like, and share this. Because what happens next is where this crisis reveals its deepest lesson. By 2022 and 2023, the crisis had become impossible to hide. South Africa had its worst blackouts in history. In 2024, the CSIR reported that load shedding dropped by 76%, compared with 2023. That sounds like good news, and it is. But it also tells you how terrible 2023 had been. That year was the breaking point. People began asking, how did we let it get this far? And slowly, one answer kept coming back. The country had lost too much technical memory. Inside Eskom and around it, people began saying the quiet part out loud. There was a shortage of skills. The utility needed veterans. It needed former employees. It needed people who knew how to run damaged stations. Not in theory, in practice, not next year, now. That was deeply awkward. For years, calls to bring back former staff had met resistance. There were legacy race tensions. There were union tensions. There was fear of what the move would imply. Would it mean current staff had failed? Would it mean transformation had failed? Those are powerful questions in South Africa. But blackouts are more powerful. When the lights stay off long enough, ideology loses some of its confidence. That is where the story takes its famous turn. In 2022, Minister Pravin Gordhan made a broad call for help. The government stressed this was not a call to one race only. It was for skilled personnel regardless of race. But everyone understood why the moment was explosive. A union called Solidarity offered lists of personnel. The shortlist included about 300 power experts with thousands of years of combined experience. Many had spent their lives in power generation. Most of the need was in the part of the system bleeding hardest. Eskom began bringing back smaller groups of veterans in mentoring and technical roles. Former employees were returning to train less experienced staff and help diagnose plant problems. They were coming back as mentors, quiet fixers, adults in the room. Think about how humiliating that moment must have felt for the state. A country that argued over who should be inside the institution had to admit it could not recover without those who left. But it was also more than humiliation. It was a confession that complex systems do not care about slogans. A boiler does not care what speech was given in Parliament. A turbine does not care about talking points. These machines ask only one question. Do the people touching me know what they are doing? That is why this story hits so hard. Every country has arguments about fairness and access. But if a state treats competence as secondary, the laws of physics eventually enter the debate, and physics does not negotiate. This is a warning for every nation trying to run a state with political pride. Still, we have to be honest. Even the return of veteran engineers was not a magic switch. The crisis was too deep. No small group of experts can wave away years of decay. Eskom's recovery needed better maintenance, discipline, and plant management. It also benefited from rising private generation, especially rooftop solar, that reduced pressure on the grid. This matters because people love simple redemption stories. Real life is meaner than that. South Africa's grid did not collapse overnight, and it did not recover overnight, but recovery did come. Slowly first, then visibly. By 2024, there were real signs of improvement. On 15th in May 2026, Eskom said South Africa had completed a full year without load shedding. In a country where blackouts had shaped daily life, one full year without rotational cuts felt unreal. Eskom credited its recovery plan. Official statements spoke about resilience and sustained progress. They also made something else clear. The system was still not risk-free. Illegal connections, theft, and old coal units still face the system. The patient still needs treatment. A comeback story can become dangerous if it turns into denial. Yes, parts of the grid stabilized. Yes, experienced people were brought back and their knowledge mattered. A lot. But if institutional lessons are ignored, the country could repeat the pattern in water or rail. The deeper truth is that a modern state cannot afford to lose hard-earned competence faster than it can replace it. It cannot play politics with training pipelines or let corruption eat the maintenance budget. It cannot award critical contracts through networks that value connection over quality. And South Africa paid for all of that. Think of the human chain behind one blackout. A mother finds spoiled food. A student loses an evening. A nurse waits on backup power. That is how national decline feels in real life. Not dramatic every second, just exhausting and expensive. What happens to a society when people no longer believe the basic systems will work? They begin building private escapes, generators, solar, tanks. Soon the nation is living in layers. The lights going out was terrible, but the deeper danger was the slow privatization of hope. And yet, systems can recover if people are willing to face uncomfortable truths. South Africa fixed part of its grid by admitting it needed skills, discipline, and knowledge transfer. That admission came after enormous damage, but it came. If you want more breakdowns like this, press like. Why do governments wait for humiliation before they respect competence? Why is humility so expensive in public life? Maybe because competence is quiet. It does not campaign well. A well-run power station is boring. Good maintenance is boring, until the day it vanishes. Then the whole country learns what boring was worth. That is why veteran engineers matter. They represented depth, memory, and standards. A healthy country does not choose between fairness and competence. It builds both. It grows new talent while protecting the old talent needed to train it. Representation without performance will eventually destroy public trust. South Africa is still wrestling with that balance between equity and performance. Any plan that weakens the skill base of a critical institution is self-sabotage. And if corruption joins the party, the damage multiplies. Corruption loves weak institutions. The Eskom collapse is a story about how states decay through the slow breakdown of standards. Once that process begins, even talented young staff are trapped inside broken systems. If you care about the next generation, build them, train them, pair them with masters. Protect institutions from political vanity. Reward people for keeping systems alive. You do not preserve a civilization by insulting competence. There is hope in admitting a mistake. The goal is not to win the argument of the weak, but to keep the country working. If you destroy the bridge between experience and the next generation, the river will remind you why it existed. South Africa learned that competence is not a luxury item. It is a moral duty of a state. Every civilization depends on people whose names the public never knows. The operator, the artisan, the planner. The blackout begins years earlier, when the people who know how to stop it are ignored. And by the time the candles come out, the real collapse has already happened.